Remember that adage that Trumplicans have obviously forgotten, that being pro-business is not the same thing as being pro-free market capitalist? Well, they're finding out now, and if they don't realize it yet, and they don't, they will eventually. Trump is drawing a lot of attention this week for green lighting the Keystone XL pipeline and the Dakota pipeline, which in and of itself is a good thing, although he's couching it in and threw in a caveat about how the United States needed to renegotiate this deal with Canada, and he's also throwing in a requirement, which he doesn't have the legal authority to do, that all the steel used in the construction of these pipelines be American-made steel, which sounds like at least a potential deal breaker, given that we're not dealing in Canada with the Stephen Harper conservative government anymore. We're dealing, of course, with the liberal government of Justin Boy Trudeau. So even while Trump is green lighting Keystone XL and the Dakota pipeline, he's laying the groundwork for those two pipeline deals to fall through as effectively as Barack Obama obstructed them for the past 8 years. Just one more example of how Donald Trump really is not a capitalist. He is a mercantilist. I remember Douglas V. Gibbs, last April or May, arguing that, well, at least Trump is a capitalist. I said, and my answer to that was always the same. No, Trump is a businessman. It doesn't make him a capitalist. I mean, by that definition, if Trump fits within the definition of capitalist, then so does George Soros. How many Trump supporters would buy the notion of George Soros as a capitalist? Well, he is. He uses capitalism, but he's not a capitalist, and neither is Donald Trump. And, of course, Mona Charen, in her syndicated column last week, delved into the details of why. Donald Trump's trade policies will hurt the American middle class that got him elected. We've been instructed not to take our new president literally. Actually, we're not supposed to take him seriously. Just a little edit there. But instead, seriously? Well, those two don't really go together. As I write, as I speak, there are hints that the inaugural address, as it did, focused on the theme of America First. He has no idea of the historical context of that phrase. Trump may or may not be familiar with he's not familiar with the historical taint of that phrase, but in any case, the meaning he attaches to it has been clear enough. Throughout his career, Trump has been consistent on two issues: trade and admiration for dictators. He departs from the consensus about American leadership in the post-World War II era. Rather than seeing the United States and its security guarantees and promotion of trade as providing the means through which the world and the U.S. has seen unprecedented growth, peace, and prosperity, he thinks we've been chumps. He actually talked about, in his inaugural address, he used the phrase walling off our economy. Yeah, if you want it to collapse, then sure, go ahead. America First is a declaration of no more Mr. Nice Guy. This is the link between his views on NATO and trade. In the former case, he appears to think that the NATO alliance is a favor we do for an ungrateful Europe. By the way, Secretary of Defense, freshly confirmed Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, came out today and said that the bond between the United States and NATO is unbreakable. So that could lead to some awkward moments at the next cabinet meeting. While it would be a very positive development if every NATO member were to spend the agreed upon 2% of gross domestic product on defense, there is reason to doubt that Trump's comments are simply veiled threats to achieve that. Is it pure coincidence that while denigrating NATO, Trump has shown excessive friendliness to Vladimir Putin, whose chief goal, just ask General Mattis, is undermining the alliance so as to facilitate Russian conquest of Europe? I mean, the argument could be made over the past generation that NATO no longer had a reason, its original purpose for existing no longer existed. I mean, NATO was the Western alliance against the Soviet Union. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO was an organization who no longer had its original purpose. Now it was adopted to other things and so on and so forth. The irony being that now that original purpose has returned, facing the Russians under Vladimir Putin. And now here's Trump saying we don't need NATO anymore. Well, actually, yeah, we do. Trump has offered differing explanations for his tweets about NATO being obsolete. He has mentioned defense spending. He has also cited failure to cooperate on terror. But Article 5 of the North Atlantic Charter, the one that says that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all, has only ever been invoked for Europe to help America. Many NATO countries contributed troops and other support to the war in Afghanistan, including the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, Turkey, Norway, and the Netherlands, among others. Unlike his views on immigration, abortion, single-payer health care, ISIS, and countless other topics, Trump has been consistent on trade since the 80s. In 1987, he bought a full-page ad in the New York Times denouncing trade with Japan. He seems genuinely to believe that trade impoverishes us, which is nonsensical and economically illiterate, which is odd for a businessman because trade really is just another word for business. And need we remind everybody of the quantity and breadth of Trump products that are produced overseas and imported back into the United States? It is true that our economy has seen, well, our economy has been in a Democrat-engineered economic depression the past decade or so, but to finger NAFTA and other trade deals as the culprit instead of, say, overregulation or high taxes is perverse. Trump cites the trade deficit figures with China. Remember, a trade deficit, another word, a synonym for trade deficit is capital surplus. Trump cites the trade deficit figures with China and others to prove that we are losing in a zero-sum competition. Economics is never zero-sum. And the jobs are being outsourced due to stupid leadership by politicians. Well, guess what, folks? These are Democrat talking points. Or they were. Manufacturing jobs are being lost to automation more than anything else. Technology. Is Trump going to issue an executive order banning any further technological advancements? Also, commerce, another word for trade, unlike war, has winners on both sides of the transaction, not winners and losers. The United States economy boomed during the 80s and 90s, despite large trade deficits. Those who claim that the United States is running a trade deficit in goods due to unfair trade practices of trading partners never seem to make the case that our trade surplus in services, large and growing, is due to our own unfair practices. In other words, If we lose, it's on them. If we win, well, it's not on us. I mean, the only thing that seems to be unfair or called unfair is the result. Kind of like how Donald Trump looks at election results. If he loses, well, it was rigged and it's unfair. If he wins, well, he's just awesome. Self-serving claptrap. Trump has made a number of fine cabinet appointments, but remember, they'll be working for Trump, so let's not overrate the impact of that. But the trade triumvirate of Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, and the head of a new entity called the National Trade Council, Peter Navarro, are quite worrying advocates of so-called National Socialist economics. Like Trump, they see trade as a form of warfare, but it isn't. And let's not forget, trade wars can lead to real wars we really can't win. Thus the saying, if goods don't cross borders, armies do. Possible ironies here are voluminous. The people who will suffer from trade protectionism are the poor and working classes who will pay higher prices for goods and see their jobs lost due to higher prices of imports. Half of imports are used in American manufacturing, some of which go to exports. Number two, Red China is benefiting even now from other nations' fear of U.S. retrenchment on trade. Instead of American-led free trade agreements, Red China, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, gone. Trump rescinded it. By the way, did you know that the Trans-Pacific Partnership eliminated, let me say this again, eliminated 18,000 separate tariffs against U.S. exports? Guess they're coming back. Instead of American-led free trade agreements, Red China is lighting up Pacific nations for a regional comprehensive economic partnership in which Beijing calls the shots. Kind of akin to the old Japanese East Asia co-prosperity sphere. 3, the United States is the world's largest trading nation. Protectionism is a punch in our own nuts. To punish Red China or anyone else for selling us too many products, Trump can impose higher prices only on Americans. It's just another form of socialism. National socialism. Trump has a great deal of independent power on trade matters. Here is something for Republicans in Congress to mull. If Donald Trump, the great businessman but anti-capitalist, ignites a trade war and tanks the economy, voters will draw the lesson, well, those free market Republicans have done it again. Capitalism equals depression. Remember how economically illiterate most American voters are, ladies and gentlemen. Low information voters. That applies to economics more than anything else. Heck, Trump is a low information president. And his trade policies, his economic policies are economically illiterate, just like any Democrats. That's why I say that when you're talking about Trumpnomics, you could just as easily have Richard Gephardt. Remember him? The big labor lackey. And you notice who is cheering Trump's anti-trade measures the loudest? Bernie Sanders, the Democrat socialist, and big labor. Those are not Democrat constituencies. I'm sorry, those are not Republican or conservative constituencies. Those are Democrats. Those are leftists. People who are anti-capitalist, anti-prosperity. And they're cheering Donald Trump. I mean, connect the dots, folks. It's not complicated, or it shouldn't be. The Heartland Institute had some additional things to say on this topic. Instead of setting up conditions to make America great again, quote unquote, trademark, the trade and economic policies proposed by Donald Trump threaten to increase the government's power over U.S. workers, which would make economic prosperity more difficult for many to achieve. Sounds like a Democrat policy, doesn't it? At a December 1st press conference, then Vice President-elect Mike Pence seemingly renounced his belief in capitalism, remember this, telling the New York Times, quote, "The free market has been sorting it all out and America's been losing." Trump interjected, saying, every time, every time. Well, he has no confidence in America, does he? Ronald Reagan always had confidence in America. And Americans. Trump doesn't seem to have any confidence in America or Americans at all. He must protect them. Do we need protecting, I guess? We need protecting from prosperity. On December 4th, Trump launched an early morning tirade on social media, during which he wrote, quote, "Any business that leaves our country for another country, fires its employees, builds a new factory or plant in the other country, and then thinks it will sell its product back into the U.S. without retribution, his word, or consequence is wrong. There will be a tax on our soon-to-be strong border of 35% for these companies wanting to sell their products, cars, air conditioning units, etc., back across the border." So Donald Trump is a tax raiser. Sounds like a Democrat policy, doesn't it? Trump added that he plans to make attempts to relocate a business to avoid government regulations and mandates, an expensive mistake. In other words, Trump plans to build a regulatory wall around the United States to keep businesses and people in, whether they want to stay or not. Sounds like a Democrat policy, doesn't it? Government bureaucrats and lawmakers use tariffs, sometimes literally, to get in the way of voluntary exchanges between consumers and producers. Anti-trade policies, such as those proposed by Trump and former free marketeer Pence, would harm everyday consumers just as much. Inflation, anybody? Just as much as the anti-consumer policies of outgoing President Barack Obama have. Now think about it for a minute. Let's go harken back to the 1970s, shall we? That halcyon decade. Why, aside from the taint of Watergate, did Gerald Ford lose his bid for a term of his own in 1976? Well, economic reasons. Inflation was a big factor. Remember the win buttons, whip inflation now? What a joke that was. And then what limited Jimmy Carter to a single term? Well, the Iranian hostage crisis certainly didn't help. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan didn't help either, but another significantly huge factor was the 18% interest rates and 13% inflation. Remember that? Remember the gas lines? Just saying. Those are historical examples of what happens when, and of the results that you get from Trumponomics. Of course, the ultimate example, the Great Depression, which could just as easily have been called the Great Trade War. The Smoot-Hawley tariff raises trade barriers in 1930, and then other countries, our trading partners, raised their trade barriers, and the everybody got poorer from it. What would have been just a recession became a decade-long global economic depression, and that facilitated the rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And thus we got the Second World War. Just saying. Ironically, Trump's war on trade, which he says he'll wage in the name of working-class men and women, his intended victims, may put working-class people out of work. Will put working-class people out of work. By using the power of government to increase the cost of foreign-made goods, the cost of manufacturing goods in the United States will increase as well. See, this notion, economics is a very complex subject that political demagogues always try to reduce to simplistic levels that simply don't exist. And that's where you get these pie-in-the-sky BS promises that always end in economic disaster. From one statist after another. First Barack Obama, now Donald Trump. By using the power of government to increase the cost of foreign-made goods, the cost of manufacturing goods in the United States will increase as well. More businesses may choose to leave the country, but Trump is going to forbid them from doing so. What gives him the constitutional authority to do that? And they may choose to leave the country and manufacture goods elsewhere, similar to how U.S. tariffs on sugar encouraged Mondelez International, the company responsible for producing Nabisco food products, to leave the country in 2015. According to official government data, an increasing amount of domestic goods and services are produced using foreign components. A trend not even a reality television star's force of personality can reverse. These sectoral intermediates, as they're termed in economic jargon, prove the inescapable reality of the well-being and prosperity of U.S. workers and free market principles are complementary, not contradictory. The data show that 24% of sectoral intermediates in manufacturing were imported in 1998. The percentage grew to almost 34% in 2006, said Lucy Eldridge, senior economist for the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics, as she wrote in the June 2010 issue of Monthly Labor Review. Eldridge continued later in the piece, quote, "There has been a steady increase in the share of imported intermediates used by U.S. manufacturing firms relative to sectoral and total intermediates observed for the private business sector. Imported materials accounted for the majority of imported intermediate inputs. However, service inputs also were imported by the manufacturing sector. Imported services' share of sectoral intermediates in the manufacturing sector grew from 1.4% in 1998 to 2.1% in 2006, while imported energy share grew slightly from 0.1% to 0.3% over the same period," close quote. Simply put, an increasing number of U.S. workers now use components from both domestic and foreign sources when producing and or providing goods and services. You can't turn back the clock, in other words. By using the force of government, to target some businesses for tax hikes and punishments and others for tax breaks and favors, the Trump business wall would make U.S. manufacturing businesses even more uncompetitive compared to economic climates in other countries. I thought that we had to defeat Hillary in order to enable U.S. manufacturing and businesses and so forth to be more competitive. Isn't that one of the reasons argued for why we couldn't let Hillary Clinton win? Because we would never be able to enable U.S. businesses to become more competitive? Well, might as well have elected Hillary. I mean, what is using the force of government to target some businesses for tax hikes and punishments and others for tax breaks and favors sound like? It sounds like a Democrat idea, does it not? It sounds like a liberal idea. It sounds like a progressive idea. It sounds like a left-wing idea. Conservative Republicans, you know, I remember vividly the late William E. Simon, Treasury Secretary under Presidents Nixon and Ford. He once wrote, the role of a conservative Republican should be to get the government the hell out of the way of the private sector, then go off and play a round of golf. That ought to be their job. Freeing the free market. Does that sound like what Trump is proposing? No, it doesn't, does it? Trump should stick to ensuring the United States is open for business, the conclusion of his early morning December tweet storm, by embracing free market principles, such as reducing corporate tax burdens and deregulation and moving the country from a global tax system to a regional one. That's not what he's doing, is it? What Trump should not do under any circumstances is use government force to reshape, or try and reshape, the complex and beautiful web of manufacturing inputs and outputs described by Milton Friedman as the millions of tiny know-hows naturally and miraculously forming and cooperating to satisfy even the smallest of man's necessities. But that's exactly what he's planning to do, just like any other Democrat president. By ending the federal government's practice of taxing U.S. companies' foreign earnings and money transferred from overseas affiliates to headquarters in America, fewer businesses would seek to leave the country for friendlier business climates. In other words, hostages. Ego-boosting adventures in government economic engineering, such as the economic wall building and connection breaking proposed by Donald Trump, do nothing to benefit everyday working people. The very group Trump claims to be waging his economic crusade for. In fact, the policies proposed would prove to be disastrous for people who would benefit the most from economic growth. Tell me again why it was so important to defeat Hillary? Because we got her policies.